Welcome to Chesapeake Treasure. I'm Pete Lesher, Chief Curator for the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. And today I'm going to be introducing some objects and a model relating to the bug-eye Florence Northam. The Florence Northam was much like many bug-eyes on the bay. She oystered in the wintertime and she freighted grain or produce or maybe even lumber in what was for her the off-season, the summer. And interestingly, in her later years, she was built in 1890, but in the 1920s, when there were workboat races on the Chesapeake Bay, held in various places and sponsored by the Baltimore Sun papers, she won her division. She won the bug-eye class for the workboat races twice, in 1928 and 1929, and we actually have the trophies that she won in these workboat races. The first one in 1928 at Bay Ridge and 1929 at Deal Island. In both of these cases, she was owned and skippered by Charles O. Chesser of St. George's, Maryland, down on the Potomac River. That's where she was working out of in those years. And when Charles Chesser sold this bug-eye, it was purchased at the height of the Depression by a Philadelphia yachtsman, a man by the name of John Childs. And Childs essentially used her for pleasure purposes. We could say that he converted her to a yacht, but he really didn't make much of a conversion, at least not above decks. There was no big yacht cabin added as some of the yacht-converted bug-eyes would have had. She looked on deck much like she did in her working days. And all of these items were the trophies came with the boat when he bought the boat, and he had the bug-eye model made for him at about the same time when he was acquiring the boat. And when his son, years later, decided that he needed to move to smaller quarters, he gave the trophies and the bug-eye model and a beautiful photograph of her in the days when her father was sailing her on the Chesapeake to the museum. And an unfortunate accident happened as we were picking these objects up. The donor was carrying the model out of the door by its cradle when a gust of wind blew the boat onto the sidewalk, and it broke on the sidewalk. The sails were broken, the masts were separated from the model, and I assured him that we would have this repaired. And indeed, one of the members of the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum's Model Guild stepped up and put it back together and re-rigged it. Some of the rigging had been rotten and such. And when he brought it back to us, he said, "Do you know who made this model?" And I did not. There was no evidence about who might have made it. He said, "Well, you might have looked at the bottom of the cradle, and it's signed. There's a label on the bottom of the cradle that it was the model was built by Captain R.D. Culler." Well, that happens to be Pete Culler, a yacht designer and a good boat carpenter who in those days was working at the Oxford Boatyard. Well, that's where John Childs had this boat converted to a yacht, was at Oxford Boatyard. Captain Pete Culler, this famous small craft designer, was working there at the time, and he evidently was commissioned to build a model. We didn't even know that he was a model builder. We hadn't seen other models by Pete Culler, but here, and this was a wonderful connection because at the time we were building skiffs designs by Pete Culler in our boat shop for our Apprentice for a Day program. This is an example of where the object carries all these stories with it, and on top of that, this is an object that additionally has, in addition to all these really interesting connections, has other objects connected to it. It's got a real context to it, a historical context related to its workboat races from its racing days, and as well as from its cruising days under John Childs and his son, sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. A beautiful example, really, of our theme of from work to play, about how the Chesapeake, a century and a quarter ago, was a place of commercial activity, of fisheries activity, And today, much of that evidence is gone. And when you go out on the Chesapeake today, along our waterfronts, what will you see but recreational boating and recreational activities? A real transformation on the bay, embodied in this really wonderfully done little model of the bug eye Florence Northam. Thank you for joining me today for A Chesapeake Treasure.